Hello and welcome to Access Asia. I'm Thomas Waterhouse and here's what's coming up. Demanding change down under, calls for an end to racial discrimination grow louder across Australia, with Indigenous rights at the heart of many protests. They're usually at loggerheads, but nuclear neighbours India and Pakistan have joined forces to fight the worst plagues of locusts in decades. And the Chinese inventors behind these smart glasses think they're the best way to monitor temperatures during the COVID-19 pandemic. First then, thousands of Australians have been jumping on the Black Lives Matter bandwagon following the death in the US of George Floyd. Anti-racism protests have been taking place in major cities, with one of the cornerstones being frustration at the lack of Indigenous rights. For more, we can speak now to Amy McGuire, an Aboriginal writer and journalist who joins us now from Queensland. Amy, thank you very much for being with us. First of all, in what ways are these Australian demos different to those seen in the US and elsewhere?
Well, in relation to the numbers, there's not a great deal of difference, but Aboriginal people have actually been protesting the deaths of Aboriginal people at the heart of the justice system for a very long time. The difference is now white Australia is actually standing up and taking notice, and that's largely been from a little bit of guilt over what's happening overseas and seeing how Black lives are treated in the US, but also seeing how Black lives are treated in our own country. Before it has been shrouded in secrecy, and now it's sort of out in the open. So finally, I think we're in a situation where white Australia might be ready to sit up and actually listen to what Aboriginal people have been calling for years, and that's for our lives to matter. Aboriginal lives should matter.
Now, Amy, you've been focusing on the number of Aboriginal deaths in police custody in Australia. Tell us more about that.
The difference is, I guess, when you're looking at the US, is that a lot of it isn't caught on video footage, and I think that's it's harder to actually explain what's actually happening because it's tied to history, it's tied to intergenerational trauma that is at the heart of the country. And so I think it's hard to actually articulate and to show non-Indigenous Australia what's actually happening. And there's a rhetoric that actually covers over the violence of the justice system and how it specifically discriminates against Aboriginal people because of their race, class and even gender. And so it's harder to articulate because it's not as easy to see in a video camera, in video footage. And yet we continue to have these deaths. There's never been a conviction over an Aboriginal death in custody in this country, and yet we've had 437 deaths since 1991. So someone has to be held accountable, and there's never calls for accountability. When an Aboriginal person dies in custody, they just move on. And so that's what has to change. There has to be accountability because we have to say there can be no more deaths at the hands of the justice system.
Do you believe in any way that this latest wave of protests will actually lead to any concrete reforms?
I hope so. I think we're in a very different place. I was actually quite shocked to see just the numbers that came out in capital cities. We had tens of thousands of people from all walks of life actually coming out, making a stand. And so I would hope that this does lead to change. I think it's sort of a once in a lifetime sort of opportunity to actually get these issues on the mainstream.
And finally, what has been the Australian government's response to these recent rallies and the views that have been shared by demonstrators?
It's been incredibly disappointing. Basically, they've put it up against, they've basically blamed protesters by saying that we're being reckless and selfish because we're protesting in a pandemic, not actually acknowledging the fact that Aboriginal communities have been ahead of the public health response in relation to COVID-19. When the Prime Minister was wanting to go to football games, Aboriginal communities were actually locking down their communities way ahead of the public health response, looking overseas at international evidence. And so it's actually incredibly offensive how the government has tried to deflect and even place blame on Aboriginal protesters. We're talking about a pandemic, a global pandemic, not just COVID, but also racism. And so the government has been incredibly offensive, but it's always been offensive in relation to Aboriginal people calling for justice.
OK, Amy McGuire in Queensland, thank you very much for being with us. Next, Indian and Pakistani farmers have been confronted with the worst plague of locusts in half a century. The swarms of crop-eating insects could end up costing Pakistan $5 billion in lost harvests alone. Solange Mujam reports.
Banging on pots and pans in the hope of scaring away locusts and saving their families from hunger. For these farmers in Punjab, the noise and spraying pesticides was no match for the millions of crop-eating insects.
टिड्डी दल ने यहाँ हमला किया, उसका आम का बूरा खा गई और कपास भी सारी खा गई। हम अपने तौर पे वो जो है ना पराते वगैरह लेडीज़ भी थी हमारे, बच्चे सारे बजाते रहे हैं, भगाया उसे, लेकिन वो सारी फसल तबाह करके कुछ भी नहीं बचा हमारे पास।
Pegged a rolling emergency because swarms begin in one place and then move to another, even overseas in mountains. Multiple regions of India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka have been hit by plagues of locusts. The swarms are some of the worst seen in decades, as has been the case in Eastern Africa. Heavy rains and cyclones in 2018 and early last year created ideal conditions for the insects to breed in the Arabian Peninsula. Unrest in places like Yemen allowed the locusts to go undetected until it was too late. Declaring a state of emergency in February with crop losses expected to reach some $5 billion, Pakistan deployed the army in June to help spray.
Hamari armed forces fully on board hai, 8 to 9,000 of our soldiers are totally mobilized और ये मिलजुल कर ये इस चीज को फेस कर रहे हैं.
In a nation where already half of the children under 5 have stunted growth because of a lack of food, the locusts and the coronavirus have created additional hardship and hunger. There is a small silver lining, though. Pakistan and India have been working side by side to fight the swarms. And creative approaches are being used, such as a pilot program that pays farmers to collect the bugs so they can be dried as chicken feed.
A look now at how the continent's been battling the coronavirus pandemic. With fever being one of the main symptoms, businesses often use forehead thermometers to check temperatures. But one Chinese startup thinks its latest invention is much more practical. Claire Rush explains.
It's the new favorite gadget of Zhao Feiyu. These smart glasses give this security guard a newfound capability, allowing him to detect people's temperatures.
比如现在这两位先生的体温就是在36度3和36度4之间，就是说明是正常的。
A thermal imaging camera attached to the glasses allows users to detect the body temperatures of up to 100 people per minute from as far as 6 meters away.
测温枪呢，就是要近距离接触的，然后啊，这个测温眼镜的话就不用。 我们可以保持相对应的安全距离，然后，而且就是效率比测温枪要高。测温枪的话，像这种天气。
Checking for fever has practically become an obsession in China since the outbreak of the coronavirus. Thermometers are everywhere, including this drone, which takes residents' temperatures before they even leave their home. This startup launched the smart glasses in 2018. But it was only in March, during the pandemic, that it decided to upgrade the product with a thermal imaging camera. At €3,000 per pair, it's a jackpot for the company.
现在这款眼镜从3月底上市以来到现在，主要是比如说亚洲国家，然后拉美，然后中东地区都有进行售卖。主要的客户群体还是以政府客户群体居多。一些文件啊，还有资料相关已经发到这个招标方，具体的结果差不多会在1周之内公布。
Amid growing demand, the startup is already preparing to launch the second version of its glasses, expected to hit the market later this month.
And finally, to a huge homecoming for some huge mammals. In recent weeks, hundreds of elephants have stomped their way over Thailand's northern hills to their native villages after COVID-19 forced the attractions they normally perform at to close. Yinka Oyetade reports.
These elephants are normally used to entertaining crowds of tourists in cities across Thailand. But since the coronavirus paralyzed tourism throughout the country, some 3,000 elephants have been left idle and some have been forced to migrate back to their villages of origin in order to survive. For their handlers, looking after these elephants without a regular income is proving challenging.
We'd need at least 1,000 baht, $32 a day to look after the elephants. Gas is around half that, and then there's the cost of buying grass.
An unprecedented exodus of 1,000 elephants has taken place over the last 2 months. It was a last resort for these handlers who feared their elephants could die of starvation if they stayed at the tourist sites. But the homecoming has elephants and villagers competing for space.
There are a high chance that some of the elephants may get loose at night and roam into the farming properties, farming areas, and that would probably start what we call HEC, human-elephant conflict.
Keeping elephants captive as tourist attractions has long been denounced by animal welfare advocates. But now there is a greater concern that handlers desperate to feed their elephants will turn to logging on the Thai-Myanmar border as a source of income, a practice that is illegal in Thailand. There is hope that the pause in animal tourism will allow those in the industry to reflect on what can often be the brutal reality of how these elephants are kept.
OK, that's all from me and the Access Asia team, but do stay tuned to France 24.